was a foggy night on the Farquhar branch. Thomas had just finished taking his last train of the day and puffed safely back to the sheds he shared with Percy and Toby. When he arrived, Percy was telling Toby a scary story. "Are you still going on about those silly ghost stories?" Thomas asked as he backed down into the sheds.
"I'm telling Toby about a demon train," Percy replied.
"A demon train? Whatever next?" Thomas laughed. Toby gave an amused sigh and rolled his eyes.
"Please continue," he said to Percy.
"No one knows what this engine looks like. The only thing they can make out is the shape of the smoke box,"
Percy continued. Thomas didn't bother listening to the rest and backed further into the shed. "It's all just a bunch of rubbish," he said to himself before he drifted off to sleep. A while later, Thomas opened his eyes. He looked around. The fog seemed to have gotten thicker, making the area around him seem smaller, which made him feel more isolated. Thomas couldn't help but feel something was off. He looked around again, but slowly and more closely. He turned his gaze to the tracks in front of him, and could vaguely make out the shape of an engine's smoke box through the fog. Thomas felt uneasy, especially given that he couldn't make out anything except for the black shape of the smoke box. Thomas eyed it, trying to see if there were any features. He would soon regret it. He was able to make out something. 2 tiny, barely visible white dots where the eyes would be. Thomas stared, wide-eyed and mouth agape at the sight. Then, the engine began to move closer to him. Thomas was now panicking. "Help!" he screamed, but no sound came from his mouth. The engine moved closer. Thomas was frantic. He tried to scream, but he couldn't. He tried to whistle for help, but he couldn't. He tried to reverse, but he couldn't. Nothing Thomas tried was working. It was like he had no control of himself, that he was trapped in his own frame. The specter was now just a few yards away from him. Thomas shut his eyes and prepared for the worst. Thomas waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. He carefully squinted, then fully opened his eyes. The fog was now not as thick as it was, and the thing he had seen was now gone. "What was that?" Thomas asked quietly before realizing he could talk again. Thomas was glad that he was back in control of himself, but he didn't feel safe. Whatever it was that he saw was probably still out there, still watching him. Thomas didn't dare go back to sleep, too afraid of the specter returning and him not being able to escape. The fog still covered the branch line as Thomas puffed along it the next day. He was still tense from the previous night and kept looking all around him, trying to make sure that what he saw wasn't anywhere in sight, remaining silent the whole while. When he returned to the sheds that evening, Percy and Toby were waiting for him.
"Are you all right, Thomas?"
Percy asked. I'm fine, thanks," Thomas replied.
"It doesn't sound like it,"
said Toby. "I'm all right, really," Thomas insisted. "I'm just a bit nervous about the fog. Trying to be careful, you know." Percy and Toby didn't persist and fell asleep instead. Thomas stayed awake, however. He was scared and continued eyeing his surroundings, trying to make sure the specter wouldn't appear again. He was exhausted the next day as he puffed into Ellsbridge. He was eyeing the station in a nearby yard and trying to stay awake. He would jolt himself awake every time he began to nod off, but he wasn't able to keep it up for long.
"Wake up, Thomas."
James whistled. Thomas woke with a start.
"You were supposed to be off 5 minutes ago."
The red engine said. "Oh dear, I'd better get going," cried Thomas as he shot out of the station. Despite him going as fast as he could, he was late at every stop, and the passengers were not happy. Neither was the Fat Controller when he heard the news.
I've heard complaints aplenty from the passengers about you being late all day because you weren't getting enough sleep. It is very important that you get sleep every night.
The Fat Controller said that evening.
Now I expect you to rest up tonight.
I'm sorry, sir, but I can't, said Thomas. The Fat Controller stared.
And why ever not?
He asked sternly. Because something tried to attack me the other night, Thomas replied.
What sort of something?
Asked the Fat Controller. I couldn't see it fully due to the fog, but I could just make out the smoke box and... Thomas shivered. All I could see on the front of the smoke box were two tiny white dots where the eyes would have been.
You must have had a nightmare.
Percy put in.
You got scared of my story and your imagination went wild.
It was not my imagination, Thomas protested. I was awake when I saw that thing in the fog, but I couldn't move, speak, or even whistle for help. That godforsaken thing nearly got me, he cried. The Fat Controller listened.
I see now what it is you experienced,
he said after Thomas had finished.
What you went through that night was called sleep paralysis. It is when you're only partially awake, as in you can open your eyes and see, but the rest of your body isn't fully awake yet, meaning you can't use those parts of you,
he explained. How does that explain the thing I saw? Thomas asked.
During these night sleep paralysis episodes, you can go into a state of panic because of your inability to use anything other than your eyes,
the Fat Controller continued,
which causes you to see horrifying things that aren't there. The ant engine that you saw was one of those hallucinations.
So that thing was just my imagination, Thomas said.
Exactly,
the Fat Controller replied.
And it's not only with you. Sleep paralysis can happen to anyone.
That's a relief, Thomas said.
Now that that's cleared up, I expect you won't have any more problems,
the Fat Controller asked. No, sir, I won't, answered Thomas.
That's a good engine,
said the Fat Controller.
If you have another experience with sleep paralysis, just keep calm and keep your eyes closed, and it'll pass,
he added before turning and walking away. Thomas slept peacefully at night and was punctual with his passenger run the next day. Thankfully, he never had another experience of sleep paralysis again after that night.
Stepney, the Bluebell engine, works closely with his friend Rusty. One day Sir Topham Hatt came to see him. Rusty tells me you're in need of a change, so I want you to help Toby and Mavis in the quarry. Oh, thank you, sir, said Stepney. Shall I be away long? Just today. But please be careful. It is easy to get lost up there, so be back before dark. We will, said the driver. Stepney soon arrived at the quarry. We're glad you're here to help us, said Toby. Are these my cars? Asked Stepney. Only some of them. There's masses more in the sidings, replied Mavis. The more the merrier. Stepney was really enjoying himself. The dustier he became, the harder he worked. Mavis and Toby were impressed. Then the foreman spoke to his driver. We have a night special to take to the building site at the new branch line. Do you want to pull the train? Yes, please, said the driver. But he should have asked Sir Topham Hatt first. Night came. Be careful, Stepney, advised Toby. I will, and thank you for a lovely day. I do hope I can come back again. The line can be spooky, said Mavis. Thank you for the warning. And with that, Stepney puffed away. Stepney arrived on time and made the delivery of rocks and stones for the workmen. Then he set off for home. That's when the trouble began. The fog came down. Mavis was right. Suddenly everything does look spooky. There's a signal box, called his driver. And the signal light is green. Someone must have been expecting us. But they weren't. The points had been set in the wrong direction, but Stepney didn't realize this. Home, here we come! Then they approached an unknown area. The driver made a decision. It's best if we rest here until the fog clears. What are those strange sounds? Wondered Stepney. Then the fog slowly lifted. Oh no! We're in the scrapyards! His driver and fireman went for help. Stepney was all alone, but not for long. 2 diesels approached. Got you this time, Stepney. You'll make very fine scrap indeed. Buffer 'em, Bert. The diesels took him to the large smelter shed. Bye-bye, Stepney. Stepney looked up. Above him was a huge grabber. This engine's not for scrapping. The grabber wasn't listening. But just as it was about to grab hold of him, it stopped. There stood Sir Topham Hatt. It's a good thing I'm visiting this yard tonight. Saving you from scrap is becoming a habit, Stepney. Please stop it. Yes, sir. But I have learned something. What's that? There's no place like home. And that's exactly where you're going now. Bluebells forever.
Thomas and Percy are good friends, but sometimes Percy teases Thomas about being frightened, and he doesn't like that at all. One evening he was dozing happily, but Percy wanted to talk. Wake up, Thomas. Are you dreaming about the time you thought I was a ghost? Certainly not. Anyway, I was only pretending to be scared. I knew it was you, really. Percy went on teasing him. I hope the guard leaves the light on for you tonight. Why? Asked Thomas. I quite like the dark. Oh, really? Exclaimed Percy. I am surprised. I always thought you were afraid of the dark. I wonder why. Thomas decided to say nothing and went to sleep instead. Next day, Sir Topham Hatt came to see him. I would like you to go to the harbor tonight. You have to collect something rather unusual. What sort of something? Asked Thomas. Wait and see, replied Sir Topham Hatt. Meanwhile, Percy was moving freight cars into a siding. Henry arrived with his goods train. The signalman changed the switches, and Percy waited on the siding until Henry had steamed by. Then there was trouble. The switches are jammed, called the signalman. I can't switch them back for Percy. The workmen will have to mend them in the morning. It's too late now. Said Percy's driver. I'm sorry, Percy, but you'll have to stay here for the night. Where are you going? Asked Percy. Home for tea, spaghetti, replied the fireman. Percy was speechless. He watched as the other engines went home to the shed. Nighttime came, and Percy began to feel very lonely. Oh dear, he murmured. It's very dark. Oh, what's that? It was only an owl, but Percy didn't realize this. Oh, I wish Thomas were here too, he sighed. Thomas was waiting for his mysterious load at the harbor. Suddenly, there it was. Cinders and ashes, cried Thomas. It's a dragon. Don't worry, laughed his driver. This dragon is made of paper. It's for the carnival tomorrow. Workmen lifted the dragon onto Thomas's low loader and put lights all round it for protection. Then Thomas set off into the misty night. Percy was asleep on his siding and had no idea that Thomas was approaching him. Percy woke up with a start. "Help!" cried Percy. "I'm not going to open my eyes until my driver comes." Next morning, the switches were mended and Percy puffed back to the junction. Gordon was just about to leave with the express. "You'll never guess what I saw last night." Gordon was in no mood for puzzles. "I'm a busy engine. I don't have time for your games. I've seen a huge dragon. It was covered in lights." Gordon snorted. "You've been in the sun too long. Your dome has cracked." When the other engines heard the news, they laughed too. "Look out, Percy," chuckled James, "or the dragon may gobble you up." "No one believes me," huffed Percy. Maybe I did imagine the dragon after all. But Percy soon found out that he hadn't. "Help! Save me!" cried Percy. "It's all right," whistled Thomas, and he explained about the carnival. "By the way, how was your night out?" Percy decided to tell Thomas the truth. "Well, Percy," said Thomas, "maybe we do get scared sometimes, but if we're not afraid to tell each other, then that means we're quite brave, too."
Halloween, down goes the sun. Thomas on a nighttime run. On the tracks round every bend. It's getting dark as daytime ends. Well, it's the night ghosts and goblins play. Everyone knows it's a special day. All the trains say ghosts can be, but all the ghosts just disagree. Skeletons, ghosts, pirates too. Let's dress up, so fun to do. The station's such a spooky scene. Blow your whistles, it's Halloween. Blow your whistles, it's Halloween. Well, in every town, on every street, all the witches and goblins meet. Stop to stop and in between. Hey, blow your whistles, it's Halloween. Ooby-dooby-ra-ra-ra, is that a ghost that Percy saw? Ooby-dooby, run, 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 he'll be glad when this trip is done. Well, Halloween, down goes the sun. Thomas on a nighttime run. All the trains say ghosts can be, but all the ghosts just disagree. Skeletons, ghosts, pirates too. Let's dress up, so fun to do. The station's such a spooky scene. Blow your whistles, it's Halloween. Skeletons, ghosts, pirates too. Let's dress up, so fun to do. It'll be such a spooky scene. Blow your whistles, it's Halloween. Blow your whistles, it's Halloween. Yeah.
Flower power. It was Halloween night on the island of Soda. The moon shone brightly, and the stars twinkled in the night sky. The children's Halloween party was over. But while the children slept, all the engines were kept very busy. Thomas was alone at Tidmouth's sheds when Sir Topham Hatt arrived. He was still in his Halloween costume. You are to collect flour from the mill and take it to the bakery, he boomed. You must work with Diesel. The island needs its morning toast, and Lady Hat and I need our English muffins, he added sternly. So I'll have no mishaps tonight. Thomas didn't want to work with Diesel, but he wanted to be really useful. When Thomas arrived at Brendam, he couldn't see Diesel at all. Diesel was up to his old tricks. He rolled up behind Thomas and went, "Boo! Ah!"
Trust the silly old Steamy to be scared on Halloween,
Diesel sneered. I'm not a scared engine, said Thomas firmly.
We'll see,
wailed Diesel. Thomas and Diesel headed for the flour mill. Diesel teased Thomas with every click and every clack. When they arrived at the woods, Diesel cried,
"It's the haunted forest!"
And he called out, "Whoa! Thomas!" in a spooky voice. "Stop it," said Thomas crossly. But the breeze blew, and the branches creaked. Diesel's teasing made it seem spooky indeed. Then they came to the abandoned mine. The buildings were deserted, but they could hear a banging noise. "What was that?" cried Thomas.
"Sounds like the ghost engine looking for a Steamy to scare."
Well, I'm not scared, said Thomas. But he wished he felt as brave as he sounded. Thomas and Diesel had to stop at a red signal. It was next to a twisty old tree. The wind whistled and Thomas heard a strange cry. Suddenly, Thomas felt something touch his tender.
"Look out!" cried Diesel. "The ghost engine is after your funnel."
"Cinders and ashes," gasped Thomas. And he let out a frightened peep.
Scared engine,
Diesel teased. Thomas was very cross with Diesel. He wanted to pay him back for all his teasing. Thomas and Diesel arrived at the flour mill. Thomas rolled up to collect the flour. Then Thomas had an idea. "We'll see who's a scared engine," he puffed. Thomas biffed the freight cars out of the way and rolled up under the chute himself. When Thomas puffed out the other side, he was covered from dome to buffer in pure white flour. "Whoa!" he said spookily.
"It's the ghost engine!" cried Diesel. "It's come to get me!"
"Stop!" cried Thomas. "It's just me!" But Diesel was nowhere to be seen. After Diesel had gone, the mill seemed very quiet. But there was still work to do. The island needs its bread, thought Thomas, and Sir Topham Hatt needs his English muffins. Thomas shunted all the freight cars into one long line, and he set off for the bakery, all alone. As Thomas arrived at the twisty tree, he wished he could go faster, but it was a very long train, and he had to go slowly. Because he was going so slowly, Thomas could see that the tree wasn't spooky at all. "It was just a tree," he gasped, "and the strange cry was just an owl." Thomas was relieved. Thomas chugged towards the abandoned mine. He could still hear the spooky banging. He looked to his left and then to his right, and he saw what was making the noise.
It's just an old door, he gasped. The wind is making it crash. Finally, Thomas reached the old woods. The breeze still blew, and the branches creaked. Thomas took a big, brave puff. But without Diesel's teasing, Thomas could see the haunted forest was actually Henry's favorite forest. It's not scary at all, said Thomas. Thomas arrived at the bakery. He was tired but happy.
Oh, it's the ghost engine, sir,
Diesel told Sir Topham Hatt.
and it's come to get me.
It's not a ghost engine, boomed Sir Topham Hatt. That's Thomas. He's a really useful engine. Thomas, you have done a splendid job, Sir Topham Hatt said. You deserve an extra special washdown.
Thank you, sir, puffed Thomas proudly. And while Sir Topham Hatt waited for the first batch of English muffins, Thomas looked forward to telling his friends his Diesel Halloween story.
It was an icy day on the island of Sodor. The engines were working very hard. They didn't mind the cold because they had toasting hot fireboxes to keep them warm. That evening, Sir Topham Hatt came to the sheds. "There's a big freeze coming tonight," he said. "James and Percy are to deliver extra coal to the stations." "Yes, sir," they said eagerly, and Sir Topham Hatt drove away. "You'd better hurry," teased Thomas, "or scary Jack Frost might get you." "Who's Jack Frost?" Percy whistled nervously. "Don't be so silly," sniffed James. "Jack Frost is not scary." "Yes, he is," teased Thomas. "He's all white with a big spiky face." "Rubbish," said James. James knew Jack Frost wasn't scary, but poor Percy wasn't so sure. Percy shivered. "Jack Frost is not scary. Jack Frost is not scary. Jack Frost is not scary." Meanwhile, James puffed along his route. "Silly Percy," he thought, all steamed up over Jack Frost. Percy made his last delivery. The station master was very pleased to see him. "Oh, Percy," he cried, "we need twice as much coal to last through this freeze." "Don't worry," Percy said. "This is my last stop. You can have mine." So Percy's driver parked him in a siding with only a lantern for company. "Do you think scary Jack Frost will find me?" said Percy. "Jack Frost's not scary," chuckled his driver. "And don't worry, Elizabeth will bring you some more coal in the morning." And then his driver and fireman went home to bed. Late at night, the icy wind howled. It started to snow. Soon Percy's face was so cold, an icicle hung from his nose. "Oh, bother," Percy stuttered, but it didn't sound like Percy. It was so cold, he could hardly make a sound. At last, James was on his way back to the sheds. In the fog, he saw shadows and strange and scary shapes. "Scary Jack Frost," he whispered nervously. "Pah!" "Hello, James?" muttered Percy icily. "Scary Jack Frost," cried James, and he raced away as fast as his wheels could carry him. He didn't stop until he got back to the sheds. The next morning, Elizabeth brought plenty of coal. "Oh, my dear," Elizabeth chuffed to Percy, It looks like Jack Frost really got you. The firelighter started Percy's fire. Soon his ice mask melted away. So scary Jack Frost is only Frost, tooted Percy happily, and soon he was as warm as toast. When Percy arrived at the sheds, James was bragging to the other engines. "I saw scary Jack Frost last night," James huffed. "He even knows my name." "He also knows that you ran away," teased Percy, and all the engines whistled, including James. But Percy's was the loudest whistle of all.